My name is Casey. I am 32 years old, and for most of my adult life, I attempted to convince myself that tension inside a family could be negotiated through steady patience and restrained reactions. That belief collapsed on the night I picked up a call with no suspicion that anything unusual would happen. I greeted the line, waited for someone to speak, and instead heard background conversation that continued without acknowledgement of my presence. Then a voice delivered a sentence that did not sound accidental or defensive. It was clear, confident, and spoken while someone joked about whether I planned to visit Bangor again. God, I hope never. We would rather die than see her come back here. The silence that followed did not feel explosive or cinematic. It felt like confirmation of a long pattern in which I tried to prove loyalty, while the other side treated every boundary as disobedience. I did not clear my throat or force recognition because there was nothing left to clarify. I placed the phone away from my ear, considered how many attempts I had made to demonstrate that independence was not abandonment, and chose to end the call without announcing myself. I refused to send a text demanding explanations or apologies, since any invitation to explain would simply extend a dynamic that had drained time, money, and energy. 1 hour later, the same phone number appeared on my screen, the ringtone continuing until it expired. Another attempt arrived with shorter duration, as if urgency could undo the tone of the previous remark. I let the device go silent because silence was not avoidance. Before we go further, tell me what you would do if you picked up a call and heard your parents say they would rather die than see you return. Comment your instinct. In Bangor, family duty is often translated into a form of obedience that treats independence as betrayal. I grew up watching expectations form a kind of silent ledger where every gesture of support was stored for later collection. Even after building my own life, I learned that nothing I offered counted as generosity. If I wired money during a difficult winter, it became a precedent. If I bought groceries before holidays, it became a baseline expectation. There was never a moment when anyone acknowledged that giving came from goodwill rather than obligation. My parents developed an outlook that linked personal value to financial surrender. Love became a reward held on credit until I demonstrated enough sacrifice to earn attention. When I rented a studio in Bangor during my early 20s, they treated that space as temporary because they believed I would eventually move home again. That belief survived long after I secured stable income because the model in their minds did not have room for the idea of autonomy. My father spoke often about responsibility, but the word was a code for control. He wanted physical proximity and economic compliance. If I could afford to live alone, I could afford to contribute more. If I could afford new tires, I could afford to transfer money to him. He dressed these demands in moral language, claiming that parents deserved to be repaid for decades of care. The situation sharpened when my older brother Jason became a point of comparison. His decisions were framed as admirable even when they burdened the household. He stayed in Bangor without contributing, yet his presence counted as loyalty. When he borrowed money and forgot deadlines, my father called it a phase. When I paid bills on time and maintained my own roof, my mother suggested that success made me selfish. The contrast created a hierarchy that no one bothered to hide. Jason was never instructed to return home. He was not asked to shoulder utilities. He was celebrated for visiting twice a month while I was criticized for declining to appear every weekend. It took years to recognize that affection in Bangor could resemble interest on an emotional loan. If one parent covered a medical bill when I was young, they mentioned it whenever they needed leverage. If I visited for holidays, they recalculated that time as proof that returning for good was the logical next step. Love felt like a transaction. Every call referenced money or presents. If I spoke about professional goals, the response became a variation of goals do not excuse distance. My mother repeated it with a softness that disguised the pressure. My father stated it bluntly, implying that my job existed to benefit them. I did not describe this imbalance to friends because listeners often assume a single event causes estrangement. In Bangor, the pressure formed slowly. Every comment about duty suggested that children owed permanent access. Each reminder about cost implied that emotional permission could be revoked. A childhood built around small debts matures into adulthood shaped by guilt. The turning point occurred when talk shifted from suggestion to instruction. My father began insisting that I move back into the old house. He framed it as a responsibility that should precede personal choice. According to him, adults proved character through proximity. He dismissed the idea that distance could coexist with care. When I said I handled my bills independently, he argued that financial stability increased what I owed. His logic did not contain balance or boundaries, only extraction. The most revealing element was the silence surrounding Jason. He was not asked to relocate. He was not measured by output. He occupied a protected status that confirmed what I already knew: expectations functioned selectively. If duty were truly moral, it would apply evenly. Instead, it targeted the child who demonstrated capacity. Contribution became punishment for competence. I reached a private conclusion during those conversations. In Bangor, family felt like a contract with no expiration. The terms shifted whenever convenience demanded it. Consent did not matter. Choice did not matter. The only consistent requirement was compliance. That belief system shaped every phone call and every request until I understood that their definition of family could not include autonomy without interpreting it as defiance. That night arrived without warning, and I felt as if the hours after sunset carried a pressure that did not relate to my workday or personal plans, but seemed connected to whatever Bangor demanded next. I had just finished setting aside a few receipts to monitor my monthly spending when my phone lit up. The message came from my mother, Elaine, who rarely contacted me unless money traveled in only one direction. The text said that she needed $2,000 to repair a roof leak, followed by a sentence that removed any pretense of conversation. She wrote, "It's your responsibility now." There was no greeting, no question about my health, no curiosity about where I lived, only the insistence that adulthood within our family was expressed through immediate contribution. I stared at the phrasing, trying to understand when financial support had turned into an obligation that could never be renegotiated. I typed slowly, reminding myself that clarity mattered more than apology. I explained that I had personal expenses to manage, and I would not commit to covering ongoing demands that arrived without context. I reminded Elaine that I lived independently and arranged my finances with purpose. When I pressed send, I felt a subtle shift inside my chest, as if I had just stepped across a marked line between participation and refusal. Her reply arrived before I had time to put the phone down. She ignored every sentence I wrote and accused me of abandoning my family. She told me that questioning monetary requests proved a failure of character. She insisted that if I wanted to remain part of their lives, I needed to step up without negotiation. The language felt less like communication and more like possession. I read it twice to confirm I had not misinterpreted her tone. A second notification pulled my attention. The message came from my older brother, Jason. He wrote that I had always been ungrateful. He claimed that refusing to send money showed how little loyalty meant to me. He never mentioned offering financial help himself. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not acknowledge the uneven expectations placed across siblings. He simply labeled me the problem and positioned himself as the loyal child by echoing her accusations. I recognized that pattern from our younger years, yet seeing it typed into a phone screen made the emotional accounting sharper. His involvement confirmed that the request had never been about necessity. It was about confirmation of control. I considered calling, though. The idea of hearing their coordinated outrage felt unnecessary. I typed a final response that outlined my position with measured restraint. I told Elaine that emergencies did not create ownership over my income. I told her that responsibility does not eliminate personal boundaries. I told her that adulthood cannot be validated through forced agreement. I pressed send without waiting for a reply. A longer message arrived moments later. Elaine informed me that I needed to evaluate my standing as a functioning adult. She wrote that real families did not question financial duties. She stated that by withholding payment, I demonstrated immaturity. Nothing in her text reflected respect or partnership. It was a command written as judgment. I did not respond. I held the phone for a few seconds, reading the words until their weight dissolved into something familiar. The exchange did not feel like a crisis. It felt like a record. Every message sharpened my understanding of what counted as loyalty in that household. If I complied, I would confirm that my income existed for their private use. If I refused, I would be treated as defective. Silence became the only path that did not damage me further. I placed the device beside me and allowed the room to remain still. I did not apologize. I did not negotiate. I concluded that night with a recognition that financial boundaries do not arrive as declarations, they arrive as decisions. I made one in that moment, and I did not look back. 2 weeks later, I drove back into Bangor because my parents told me to show up for dinner. They did not phrase it as an invitation. It was an instruction presented as concern, and I agreed since I still believed a calm conversation might change the tone of everything that had happened. The moment I walked into the house, Richard placed his hand on my shoulder as if ownership came with blood. He said I looked tired, but his tone made it sound like exhaustion, was proof that my choices away from Bangor were collapsing. I sat down across from him while Elaine carried plates to the table. None of them asked how my work was going or how I had been handling the distance created by the recent conversations. They opened with a verdict. Richard told me it was time to come back to Bangor permanently. He said my job in another state would never lead to stability, and he insisted that responsible adults stayed near their families because independence was an illusion. He spoke as though every choice I had made was juvenile. I told him I enjoyed building a life outside Maine, but he cut that sentence apart and said independence was an offensive word when a family needed help. Elaine added that I needed to stop imagining a future disconnected from the house where I grew up. She said emotional distance was a form of abandonment, then asked how long I planned to keep pretending that privacy was a sign of maturity. I tried to talk about boundaries, but she turned that into evidence that I had been corrupted by selfish thinking. Jason joined once he finished chewing and wiped his hands with the slow confidence of someone about to deliver a lecture. He said I had been dramatic for months and that leaving Bangor had poisoned my common sense. According to him, returning home would fix everything. He did not define everything because vagueness made the claim sound like universal wisdom. I asked him whether he would ever move back if he was in my position, and he said privilege made that question meaningless. He told me that I had no right to ask others to contribute when I had always been the one who needed to learn loyalty. Richard looked at Jason with deliberate approval, then returned his attention to me. He said adulthood meant paying attention to the people who built your life, and he wanted confirmation that I was finished with the life I had created away from Bangor. I told him leaving my career behind would be unnecessary self-sabotage. He called that an excuse. Elaine grabbed the opportunity to present my refusal as moral failure. She said my inability to send money without hesitation was proof that I did not understand respect. Her tone wrapped every sentence in guilt. She finally asked if I had considered the impact of emotional absence on the family reputation. It would have been easier if she had said she resented my choices, but resentment always hides inside phrases about responsibility. I kept breathing through every comment. I refused to raise my voice. I listened while they explained how a return to Bangor would make me better, and I watched them ignore the fact that Jason had never been asked to sacrifice anything. When I said that out loud, Jason smirked without shame. He said expectations were different for people who could be trusted. I asked him whether unconditional trust had ever been proven. He responded by telling me doubt was toxic. Richard ordered him to stop talking and said I needed to remember the foundation of family loyalty. He said trust flowed upward, not sideways. I realized at that moment the entire dinner represented a performance of authority rather than care. The meal ended before the plates were empty. I pushed my chair back and told them I was leaving. Richard said walking away was immature. I said staying would be worse. I reached for my keys, walked through the front door, and closed it without ceremony. A few days later, I stopped arguing and focused on creating an exit that could not be pulled apart by guilt. Silence had already proven more effective than negotiation, so I spent that afternoon reviewing every channel through which Bangor could reach me. The first task involved my phone. I contacted my carrier and requested a number change. The representative asked whether I was ending a relationship. I said it was a matter of personal privacy. Once the new number became active, I deleted the family group chat without hesitation. The thread had turned into a bulletin board of demands, and removing it felt like lifting a chain that I had worn for years. That decision led to smaller ones. I disabled sharing on the streaming account my parents and Jason had used without paying. I checked my banking app to ensure none of them had access, and I removed an old automatic transfer that had been created years ago when I thought helping meant belonging. Every digital step clarified how often I had tried to purchase acceptance. The more I deleted, the easier it became to breathe. Bangor had always functioned through surveillance disguised as care, and the only solution was structural distance. The next priority involved physical space. I scheduled a meeting with my landlord Patrick, who managed the building where I rented a one-bedroom. When I entered his office, he gestured toward the chair across from him and asked whether something had happened. I told him I intended to relocate into a studio closer to my workplace because I wanted an environment without unsolicited involvement. He nodded as if he understood more than I had explained. He asked how much time I needed before vacating the current unit. I said 30 days would be enough. He said the studio unit would be available soon and encouraged me to submit the paperwork. His response held no judgment, and his neutrality contrasted with the emotional accounting that dominated Bangor. Once housing became secure, I reviewed my finances. 6 months of living expenses represented a target that Richard had insulted many times. He used to call budgeting a fantasy created by people who feared hard work. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table in Bangor while he laughed at the idea that personal savings could serve as freedom. Now that memory strengthened my resolve. I opened a separate savings account to prevent accidental spending, and I transferred a specific sum into it. That amount represented groceries, transportation utilities, healthcare, and rent. Knowing that those months were covered removed any reason to answer emotional blackmail disguised as emergency. One unresolved concern involved the belongings still stored at my parents' house. The thought of returning to retrieve them implied bargaining. I chose to leave everything. Clothing could be replaced. Childhood items were sentimental, but sentiment had turned into a hook. Returning for possessions would provide Bangor with new opportunities to invent obligations. I went to a thrift store near my apartment and purchased a few replacement essentials. That small exchange felt cleaner than emotional debt. I told myself that objects should never anchor identity. With each completed task, a principle emerged. Requests for money would never receive responses. That rule required no explanation. I had listened for years while responsibility became the vocabulary for control. The only counterweight was refusal. I did not write a message announcing the boundary. Silence preserved dignity. If a request arrived through email, I archived it. If the voicemail transcribed a plea, I deleted it. The process was not petty, it was hygiene. The final step involved acknowledging that distance had nothing to do with punishment. It existed because participation under their terms meant forfeiting autonomy. I did not hate them. I simply recognized that love cannot survive inside ledgers. When the day ended, I sat at my small kitchen table and watched the notification screen remain empty. That emptiness functioned as confirmation. For the first time in years, Bangor did not dictate a single decision. 2 days later, I received a call that sounded routine enough to lower my guard. The display showed my parents' number, and I answered because neutrality sometimes seemed safer than avoidance. The first moments were simple greetings. My mother asked whether I had eaten. My father made a vague comment about weather as if small talk could erase the friction of expectation. Their tone suggested nothing unusual, yet something in their pacing felt slightly performative, like they were checking boxes on a conversational script created for civility rather than connection. I remained polite without offering details. At some point, I realized neither of them had ended the call when a new voice joined the line. There was no apology, no sign that they understood the line was open. Instead, I heard a question from someone whose voice I did not recognize. The stranger asked when I planned to visit Bangor again. A short pause followed long enough to signal discomfort. Then I heard the sentence that ended any concept of negotiation. My mother said, "God, I hope never." My father replied, "We would rather die than see her come back here." The stranger did not respond. My parents did not correct themselves. They continued speaking casually, which made each syllable feel deliberate rather than impulsive. I did not interrupt. I did not clear my throat to signal presence. I let the words remain whole untouched by argument. Confrontation would imply that I believed clarification could restore trust. I pressed the end call button and placed the phone on the table. That gesture felt like a line being drawn across years of rationalization. My chest felt steady rather than wounded. Silence gave me a form of self-respect that their vocabulary had never included. The hour that followed felt quiet. My phone remained face down. I tried not to anticipate the next move, yet I understood patterns. Their calls often arrived once emotion shifted toward fear. The ringtone eventually began. I recognized urgency by the number of consecutive attempts. I let the sound continue until it stopped. When they called again, I watched the name appear without lifting the device. Eventually, the ringing ended. The room seemed to exhale. The absence of response did not represent cruelty. It represented choice. I had no interest in explanations that transformed contempt into misunderstanding. Explanations only stretched injury into a longer narrative. I once believed that healing required conversation, but I understood that dialogue cannot exist where dignity has already been priced out. Some doors must close without ceremony. Their statement did not shock me. It clarified them. I walked to my kitchen window and looked at the street without forming metaphors or conclusions. Life continued outside that statement. A bus stopped at the curb. A woman guided a child across the intersection. These ordinary movements suggested that my parents' perspective did not define the world. The smaller the voice of contempt became, the easier it was to listen to something interior. I thought about the years spent trying to fit into the outline they drew. That outline demanded acquiescence. It demanded a version of me that treated proximity as duty. Hearing their words offered a different rule. If presence inspires resentment, absence becomes mercy. I accepted that concept without dramatics. I poured a glass of water and sat down at my table. I did not compose a rebuttal. I did not shape a memory into narrative. I allowed myself to exist apart from justification. An hour later, I checked my phone. One missed call lingered. No voicemail accompanied it. I deleted the notification. The screen returned to neutral. That neutrality provided closure. There would be no dialogue, no retrospective, no semi-conciliatory phrases. The relationship did not require a postscript. That evening, I prepared dinner with a quiet mind that expected nothing. I moved through simple motions with a kind of calm that followed the decision I made earlier in the day. The first call came while I was slicing vegetables. I let it ring once before picking up. My cousin Dana introduced her voice with a tone that mixed curiosity with obligation. She explained that my parents were attempting to secure emergency financial assistance. According to her lenders, demanded a record of timely repayment, and my parents lacked that history. She said banks wanted proof of steady income and responsible credit behavior. Nothing in their documents met those terms. The conversation did not include anger or persuasion. Dana only delivered information that she thought I should hear. I thanked her without offering commentary. She did not request a contribution, which suggested that she understood where my boundaries stood. The second call came after I sat down with my meal. Jason delivered a casual greeting, but the tone changed when he reached the purpose of his call. He said he wanted to know whether I had heard about the financial situation. I told him I had. He paused for a moment, perhaps expecting a gesture of support. He did not receive one. Then he admitted that he would not provide them with money. He said pressure made him uncomfortable. He said responsibility belonged to someone else. His wording demonstrated that favoritism does not convert into sacrifice during moments that demand actual cost. I listened without reacting. He might have expected judgment, but neutrality offered a clearer response. If he refused to help, then the narrative about my duty became a hollow philosophy rather than a family standard. I placed my phone on the table after the call and tried to finish my food, although appetite felt secondary to thought. The third call arrived from someone I did not anticipate. A woman introduced herself as Nadine, a former coworker of my mother. I remembered her name from past holidays. She said she wanted to speak because gossip from Bangor had begun circulating. According to her, my mother talked about me in ways that framed distance as betrayal. The comments portrayed independence as abandonment. Nadine said those words reached people who once respected the effort I made to build a life without leaning on anyone. She said the situation reflected poorly on the family. Her tone expressed disappointment rather than curiosity. I did not defend myself because no narrative needed correction. I thanked her for reaching out. She closed the call by telling me to take care of myself. After the last conversation, I leaned back in my chair. I observed how each call delivered a distinct message that aligned with one principle. Separation had begun producing consequences. Those consequences did not require action from me. They existed because the structure that once depended on my compliance could not sustain itself when denied access to my decisions. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated. Results are results, not celebrations. Families that rely on obligation often collapse under economic pressure. I cleaned my kitchen and placed leftovers in containers. My hands performed automatic tasks that matched the steadiness of my breathing. I did not rehearse explanations. I did not imagine reconciliations. The boundary did not require performance. I turned off the overhead light and let the room settle into darkness. My phone rested on the counter without vibration. That stillness confirmed my position. No returning, no transfers, no justifications. A line remains a line when action replaces apology. 3 months later, I lived inside a studio where nothing reminded me of Bangor. The routine of independence created an atmosphere that did not require performance. I woke without anticipating interference, and I slept without preparing rebuttals. The rental agreement became the first long-term commitment I signed without approval from anyone. The document came through the rental agent Caroline, who processed my paperwork and confirmed the extended lease. Her professionalism offered proof that adulthood can operate without parental audits. When she handed me the final copy, I felt an internal weight shift from permission to autonomy. I placed the contract inside a folder that held only my name, which felt more symbolic than dramatic. The apartment remained modest, but modesty paired with control produced comfort. I selected furniture that fit the space, not the preferences of others. The refrigerator contained groceries that matched my nutritional goals rather than emotional bargains disguised as care. Life became a sequence of decisions that created no debt. I did not ask for validation. I did not search for apology. The distance stopped costing energy. During the second month, Camille, my best friend, visited only once. She sat at my small table, crossed one leg, and told me that boundaries never represent cruelty. She said refusal is a form of maturity when requests threaten stability. Her visit lasted less than 2 hours, and then she returned to her own life. No weekly monitoring, no dependency ritual. Support does not require constant proximity. I appreciated her presence because it acknowledged my transition without converting it into a rescue narrative. After she left, silence became evidence that self-governance had replaced emotional negotiation. Work stabilized and paychecks deposited at predictable intervals. I planned saving goals that covered medical needs, professional courses, and relocation options if I wanted to shift cities. Financial independence did not feel triumphant. It felt neutral. Neutrality is underrated. The absence of emotional tolls produces clarity. Bangor once used obligation as currency, but the price of admission became too high. Separation cost nothing beyond temporary discomfort. No one attempted to apologize. I did not wait for remorse. My parents created conditions that produced distance, and those conditions belong to them. Accountability lives with the decisions that generate consequence. I stopped framing myself as victim or rebel. I simply practiced responsibility over my own resources. Jason never contacted me about financial matters again. Silence accomplished more than confrontation. If someone prefers hierarchy, then equality appears threatening rather than natural. I chose equality with myself. Each passing week strengthened my understanding that losing connection can be cheaper than maintaining transactional loyalty. Emotional fees disguise themselves as duty, but duty without respect erodes dignity. I paid nothing from that point forward. Detachment became a financial strategy as well as a psychological safeguard. The studio walls held no history. I slept without imagining a phone vibrating through the night. I stopped preparing explanations in advance. Stillness became routine rather than reward. I finished the third month by acknowledging a simple truth. I did not need Bangor. I may never need it again. Maturity requires evaluation of cost. Some ties bankrupt emotional reserves. Some addresses function as traps rather than homes. When release becomes an option, freedom should follow. Personal boundaries establish the economic value of emotional labor. Silence prevents exploitation when dialogue turns into extraction. Waiting for acknowledgement drains resources that never return. Growth requires prioritizing personal authority over inherited obligation. The absence of apology becomes irrelevant when self-respect restores stability. When family converts identity into liability, distance becomes an investment. Healing begins when compliance ends. Thank you for spending time inside my story and allowing space for a narrative that rejects guilt as a management system. Many people struggle against expectations that disguise themselves as love. If my experience offers clarity, then the retelling serves its purpose. Autonomy belongs to anyone willing to claim it, even when legacy argues otherwise.